"Seize that witch!" the king roared, his voice echoing through Windsor Gardens like thunder across marble halls. "Seize that witch!" King Edward of Northumbria repeated, his royal hand trembling as he pointed at the barefoot peasant girl who had just touched his son's eyes. The year was 1682, and the gardens of Windsor Castle gleamed under the morning sun like a canvas painted by heaven itself. Rosebushes stretched in perfect rows, their crimson petals catching the light like drops of living fire. Marble fountains sang their eternal song, while peacocks strutted across manicured lawns that seemed to breathe opulence with every blade of grass. The air itself smelled of privilege, jasmine mixed with the scent of freshly cut hedges, a perfume that only royalty could afford to breathe daily. In the center of this paradise, surrounded by England's finest physicians in their black robes and powdered wigs, sat a child who had never seen any of it. Little Prince William of Northumbria, barely 7 years old, sat motionless on a stone bench, his small hands folded on his lap with the patience of someone far older. His eyes, though perfectly formed, stared at nothing. 2 beautiful windows sealed shut since birth, trapping him in endless darkness. Have you ever felt invisible, trapped in a world that refuses to see you? Perhaps you or someone close has lived with the weight of impossibility pressing down on their chest, making each breath feel like a prayer that goes unanswered. King Edward stood nearby, his crimson royal cloak brushing against the grass as he paced. His crown caught the sunlight with every turn, throwing fragments of gold across the garden like scattered coins. But no amount of gold could buy what he wanted most. He had summoned physicians from Oxford, healers from Scotland, even a mystic from Constantinople who claimed to speak with angels. Each one examined the young prince, touched his eyelids with gentle fingers, peered into those unseeing eyes with instruments of brass and glass, and each one delivered the same verdict: impossible. The tissue covering the boy's retinas was too delicate, too embedded, too dangerous to remove. "One wrong movement," warned Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, the realm's most respected surgeon, and the prince could lose not just his sight, but his life. The king listened, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Around him, courtiers whispered behind gloved hands, their words floating through the air like poisoned butterflies. "A blind heir," murmured Lady Margaret Ashford, her peacock feather fan hiding a cruel smile. "How unfortunate for the kingdom!" Her husband, Lord Thomas, nodded with rehearsed sympathy, though his eyes gleamed with political calculation. A weak prince meant opportunities for those with sight and ambition. William heard everything. He had learned that blindness sharpens other senses, cruelty becomes louder, pity more suffocating. He felt his father's desperation in every frustrated breath, tasted the courtier's disdain in every hushed laugh. But he said nothing. What could a blind child offer except more disappointment? The royal physicians gathered in a semicircle, their faces grave with the weight of delivering bad news to a king who was not accustomed to hearing the word no. "Doctor." Blackwood stepped forward, his voice measured and clinical. "Your Majesty, we have examined every possibility. The membrane is fused to the retinal tissue in a way we've never encountered. Surgery would be catastrophic." "Then find another way," Edward demanded, his voice breaking slightly. The crack in the king's composure sent ripples through the assembly. Kings don't break, kings don't beg. But fathers do. "There is no other way, Your Majesty," Blackwood replied, bowing his head. The silence that followed was the kind that makes the world feel smaller, darker, more final. Even the birds seemed to stop singing, as if nature itself mourned the impossibility of hope. And then she appeared. She came through the garden's eastern gate, so quietly that at first only William noticed. He turned his head toward a sound the others couldn't hear, bare feet on gravel, the whisper of worn cloth, breathing that carried neither fear nor ambition. Just certainty. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, with long dark hair that fell past her shoulders like a waterfall at midnight. Her dress was simple homespun linen, patched at the elbows and hem, the kind worn by those who work the fields from dawn until dusk. Her feet were bare and dusty, her hands rough with calluses. She carried nothing, no bag of herbs, no mystical tools, no badges of authority, just herself, and a strange serenity that seemed to emanate from her like light from a hidden candle. The guards noticed her too late. By the time they moved to intercept, she was already standing before the young prince. "I can help you, young lord," she whispered, her voice soft as morning mist. The garden exploded into motion. Guards rushed forward, their armor clanking. Courtiers gasped with theatrical shock. Dr. Blackwood sputtered indignantly. "How dare this peasant—" It was the first time anyone had seen him smile in months. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice filled with a curiosity that had been absent for so long. "I am no physician," she said, kneeling before him so their faces were level. "I serve the great healer of heaven, who makes the impossible possible." King Edward pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with a mixture of hope and fury. "What nonsense is this? Who sent you?" His hand went to the sword at his belt, not to draw it, but to remind everyone of the power he wielded. The girl didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on William, and William turned his unseeing gaze toward her voice. In that moment, something passed between them, a connection that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with faith. "I was sent by someone who heard a father's prayers," she said simply. "I was sent because miracles don't wait for permission. If this story has moved you so far, let us know in the comments what city and country you're watching from, and leave your like so we can keep sharing stories that touch hearts around the world." The courtiers erupted in protest. "This is madness!" shouted Lord Thomas. "She's a charlatan, a witch. Or worse," added Lady Margaret, her voice dripping with venom. "She's here to harm the prince and claim some reward." But Dr. Blackwood, despite his initial outrage, found himself studying the girl with scientific curiosity. There was something about her confidence that didn't match the usual pattern of frauds and false prophets he'd encountered. Charlatans boast and promise. This girl simply stated facts as if they were already accomplished. "Let me be clear," Blackwood said, stepping forward. "If you touch the prince and cause him harm, you will be executed. Do you understand?" The girl nodded. "I understand. And I also understand that you've exhausted every option that man's knowledge can provide. So perhaps it's time to try something beyond man's knowledge." William reached out his small hand, searching for hers. "Please," he said, "let her try." The king looked at his son, really looked at him, at the hope illuminating that small face, at the way his hands trembled with anticipation rather than fear. Edward had spent 7 years watching his son retreat into silence, accepting darkness like a prison sentence. To see him reaching toward possibility again broke something inside the monarch's carefully constructed walls. "If you harm my son," Edward said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "there will be no corner of this earth where you can hide from my wrath." "I won't harm him," she replied. "I promise you that with every breath in my body." She placed her hands gently over William's closed eyelids. Her touch was warm, almost impossibly warm, as if sunlight itself flowed through her fingertips. The crowd pressed closer, dozens of eyes watching with a mixture of skepticism, hope, and morbid curiosity. "Close your eyes, young prince," she whispered. "And remember, healing begins not with sight but with belief." William closed his eyes tighter, his small face scrunching with concentration. He felt the warmth of her hands, felt something else too, a tingling sensation, gentle as butterfly wings, but persistent as rain. It didn't hurt. If anything, it felt like waking up after a long sleep. The girl's lips moved in silent prayer. No one could hear the words, but those closest swore later that the air around them seemed to shimmer. the way it does above hot stone in summer. A breeze picked up, though the morning had been perfectly still. Rose petals began to fall, spiraling down like crimson snow. And then, with a motion so delicate it barely seemed to happen at all, she withdrew her hands. Between her fingers, visible to everyone, stretched a thin membrane, translucent as spider's silk, gleaming like captured moonlight. It looked almost alive, this tissue that had sealed William's eyes for 7 years. She held it up to the sun, and it caught the light like a prism, throwing tiny rainbows across the garden. "What is that?" breathed Dr. Blackwood, his scientific mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. "The veil," the girl said simply. "Sometimes we're born with barriers that only faith can remove." The membrane dissolved between her fingers like morning dew, leaving no trace except the faint scent of roses. William's eyes fluttered open. The world rushed in, colors and shapes and light and shadow all at once, overwhelming and magnificent. He saw the blue of the sky for the first time, the green of grass, the gold of his father's crown. He saw the faces around him, dozens of faces, some kind, some cruel, all staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to fear. But most of all, he saw his father. King Edward's face was a landscape of emotion, weathered with worry, creased with years of silent suffering, wet with tears that kings aren't supposed to shed. William had imagined his father's face 1,000 times in darkness, but nothing had prepared him for this reality. The love etched into every line, the desperate hope blooming like spring flowers. "Father," William whispered, the word carrying the weight of 7 years of silence. I see the sky, the roses, your face." Edward fell to his knees, his crown tumbling to the grass, forgotten. He gathered his son into his arms and wept openly, his body shaking with sobs that came from a place deeper than royalty, deeper than duty. He cried as only a father can cry when his child is returned to him from the edge of impossibility. The garden fell silent. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Then chaos erupted. Courtiers cried out in amazement. Guards stumbled back, making signs against evil. Dr. Blackwood fell to his knees, his hands trembling, his scientific worldview crumbling like ancient parchment. But King Edward's mind moved in a different direction. His grief and joy transformed in an instant into something darker, suspicion fed by years of political intrigue and betrayal. He had seen too many plots, weathered too many assassination attempts, been betrayed by too many smiling faces. "Seize that witch!" he roared, releasing his son and lunging toward the girl. His hand caught her shoulder, shoving her backward with such force that she stumbled, falling to the grass. "Father, no!" William cried out, his newly opened eyes wide with horror. "Guards!" Edward commanded. "Take her to the dungeons. This is dark magic witchcraft. She's put some spell on my son." We've all witnessed moments when fear masquerades as protection, when love twists into something sharp and wounding. Have you ever seen someone you care about make a terrible mistake, born from the very depth of their caring? The guards rushed forward, their hands reaching for the girl, but she didn't fight, she didn't run. She simply stood, brushing grass from her simple dress, and looked at the king with eyes full of sadness. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "I understand your fear, but your son is healed. That should be enough." "Enough?" Edward spat the word like poison. "You've used some demon's trick, some illusion. When it fades, when he's blind again, or worse." William was sobbing now, his hands reaching toward the girl. "She helped me. She didn't hurt me. Look at me. Really look. I can see." Dr. Blackwood, his legs still shaking, approached the prince. With trembling hands, he examined William's eyes, holding them open to the light, checking for any sign of the membrane that had been there just moments before. "It's gone," he breathed. "Completely gone. The retinas are clear, healthy, perfect." He turned to the king, his face pale. Your Majesty, there's no trace of the tissue. It's as if it never existed." "Then she's taken it to use in some dark ritual," Edward insisted, though his voice carried less certainty now. He looked at his son, really looked, and saw not pain or confusion, but clarity. Those eyes, dark and bright and finally seeing, looked back at him with perfect vision. The girl spoke again, her voice cutting through the confusion like a bell. "I take nothing. I serve nothing but love and healing. And I make no demands of you, Your Majesty. Your son is healed. That is all that matters." She turned to leave, but William broke free from his father's arms and ran to her, his small hands clutching at her patched dress. "Don't go," he pleaded. "Please don't go. I want to thank you. I want to know your name." She knelt down, bringing herself to his eye level once more. Up close, William could finally see her clearly, a face young but wise, eyes the color of honey touched by sunlight, and a smile so gentle it made his heart ache. "My name doesn't matter," she whispered. "What matters is that you remember. Sight is a gift, but how you use it determines whether you're truly seeing." "What does that mean?" William asked, his voice small and confused. She touched his cheek softly. "It means that many people have eyes, but still miss what's right in front of them. They see faces, but not hearts. They see power, but not pain. They see wealth, but not worth." She glanced at King Edward, still frozen in confusion and shame. "Promise me you'll use your sight to really see people. All people, not just those with crowns and titles." William nodded solemnly, though he didn't fully understand. "I promise." She stood, and before the guards could reach her, before the king could give another order, she walked toward the garden's eastern gate. Her bare feet made no sound on the gravel. Her figure seemed to blur at the edges like watercolor running in rain. "Wait!" Edward called out, his voice breaking. I was wrong. I'm sorry." "Please wait." But she didn't turn back. She passed through the gate, and when the guards rushed after her, they found the path empty. No footprints in the dust, no trace of her passing. She had simply vanished, like morning mist when the sun rises too quickly. The king stood in the center of his garden, surrounded by his nobles and physicians, his guards and servants, all staring at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. His crown still lay on the grass where it had fallen, abandoned and suddenly meaningless. William ran to his father, his new eyes bright with tears. "Why did you do that, father? Why did you call her a witch?" Edward dropped to his knees again, this time not from joy but from shame. He gathered his son close, his voice thick with regret. "Because I was afraid. Because I've seen so much darkness in the world that I forgot light exists too. I'm so sorry, William. I'm so sorry." Days passed, then weeks. The king sent his best riders to every village, every town, every remote corner of his kingdom. He offered rewards, gold, land, titles, anything, for information about the barefoot girl who had healed his son. He dispatched investigators to interview every peasant family, questioned every traveling healer, searched every small church and remote monastery. Nothing. It was as if she had never existed. Some said she was an angel, sent from heaven to perform one miracle before returning to the divine realm. Others claimed she was a saint, walking the earth in secret, doing God's work without seeking recognition or reward. A few whispered darker theories, that she was a ghost, a spirit of someone who had died unjustly, returning to balance the scales of fate. But William knew differently. He remembered the warmth of her hands, the certainty in her voice, the absolute realness of her presence. She wasn't a ghost or a dream. She was human, divinely blessed perhaps, but human nonetheless. Months turned into years. William grew from a small boy into a young man, and every day he used his sight to honor the promise he'd made. He studied not just with tutors of mathematics and history, but with healers and physicians. He learned anatomy and medicine, herbal remedies and surgical techniques. His father watched with pride tinged with sadness, understanding that his son would never be a typical prince. "I want to help people," William explained one evening, standing in the same garden where he'd been healed years before. He was 13 now, taller and more confident, but still carrying that gentle wisdom that made him seem older than his years. "She gave me sight not just to see, Father, but to truly see. To see suffering and choose to ease it." Edward, his beard now streaked with grey, nodded slowly. "You'll make a fine king someday. Better than I've been." "You're a good king," William said loyally. "You just forgot for a moment that fear and love sometimes look very similar." The king smiled sadly. "When did you become so wise?" "The moment I could see," William replied simply. At 17, Prince William established the first royal infirmary in Northumbria's history. He didn't just fund it, he worked there alongside common physicians and monks who devoted their lives to healing. He touched lepers without gloves, sat with dying peasants holding their hands, cleaned wounds and changed bandages with his own royal hands. The nobles were scandalized. "A prince of the realm working like a common servant," they complained. But King Edward silenced them with a look that had grown harder over the years, forged in the fire of his own regret. "My son sees more clearly than any of you," he told them, "and I will not hear another word against him." In his private chambers, William kept something precious. In the center of his study, in a reliquary made of gold and crystal, rested nothing visible. The chamber was empty to the eye. But William insisted that inside lay the invisible thread of faith, the same thread that had pulled the membrane from his eyes. His father had commissioned the reliquary shortly after the healing, when guilt and wonder still battled in his heart. The inscription, carved in elegant Latin around the base, read words that Edward had written himself in a moment of terrible clarity. "A presence that spoke without words, remember your promise." Now, 20 years after that morning in Windsor Gardens, Prince William had become England's most beloved royal physician. His hair, still dark but touched with early silver at the temples, framed a face that had learned to carry both joy and sorrow with equal grace. His hands, trained in surgery and skilled in healing, had saved hundreds of lives, but he never forgot that he had once been unable to see. Never forgot the isolation of darkness, the sting of pity, the crushing weight of impossibility. So when patients came to him, the blind, the lame, the broken in body and spirit, he saw not their afflictions, but their wholeness. He touched them with the same gentle certainty that had once healed him. And when medical science reached its limits, when every technique and treatment failed, he would kneel beside their beds and pray, hoping that somewhere, in some distant village or hidden corner of the world, the barefoot girl was listening. Sometimes patients recovered in ways that confounded every medical explanation. Tumors vanished overnight. Broken bones healed with impossible speed. Infections that should have been fatal simply disappeared, leaving behind healthy tissue and bewildered physicians. "It's a miracle," people would whisper. "It's love," William would reply. "Love is always the greatest medicine." King Edward, now an old man with a long white beard and eyes that had seen too much, returned every year to that same garden. He came alone, without guards or attendants, moving slowly on legs that had begun to betray him with age. He would make his way to the stone bench where his son had once sat in darkness, and he would leave a single white rose on the seat. One rose for each year since the healing, one rose for each year of searching, one rose for each year of regret and gratitude tangled together like vines around his heart. He never stopped looking for her. Even as his kingdom prospered, even as William's fame as a healer spread across Europe, even as peace and plenty blessed Northumbria under his reign, the king never stopped searching for the girl he had wronged. "I need to apologize properly," he told his son one evening, his voice thin with age. "I called her a witch. I tried to imprison her. I drove away the answer to my prayers." "She knew, father," William said gently, taking his father's weathered hand. "She knew you were afraid, and she forgave you the moment she left. How can you be sure?" "Because," William smiled, "she gave me more than sight that day. She gave me the ability to see forgiveness in action. Real forgiveness doesn't wait to be asked for. It simply is." The old king wept then, as he had wept that morning so long ago, when impossibility had cracked open and shown him the face of grace. Have you ever received a gift you didn't deserve? Have you ever been forgiven before you even knew how to ask? Perhaps that's what miracles really are, not just the impossible made possible, but love given freely when we deserve it least. On a spring morning, much like that day 20 years before, King Edward made his final visit to the garden. His steps were slow, supported by a walking stick carved from ash wood. His breath came in laboured gasps, and William walked beside him, ready to catch his father if he stumbled. They sat together on the stone bench, father and son, king and healer. The roses were in full bloom, their crimson petals bright as fresh blood, their scent thick in the air. Peacocks called in the distance, fountains sang their eternal song. "Do you think she was real?" Edward asked suddenly, his voice barely a whisper. "Or did I imagine the whole thing?" William touched his father's hand. "Look at me, father. Really look." Edward turned, his faded eyes meeting his son's clear, bright gaze. In those eyes, he saw no trace of the membrane that had sealed them shut. He saw perfect vision, perfect health, perfect proof. "She was real," William said softly. "As real as this garden, as real as your love, as real as every prayer you ever whispered in the dark." "Then where did she go?" Edward's voice broke. "Why couldn't I find her?" "Maybe," William suggested, "she wasn't meant to be found. Maybe some gifts are meant to be received, not repaid. Maybe she knew that your search, your regret, your yearly roses were already enough." The old king nodded slowly, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. He placed one more white rose on the bench, the 20th, and perhaps the last he would ever leave. "Thank you," he whispered to the air, to the roses, to the memory of a barefoot girl who had seen past his crown to his heart. "Thank you for healing my son. Thank you for teaching me that miracles exist. Thank you for showing me that love is stronger than fear." The wind picked up, gentle and warm, carrying the scent of roses across the garden. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Edward thought he heard a voice on that wind, soft as morning mist, certain as sunrise. 6 months later, King Edward of Northumbria passed away peacefully in his sleep. They found him with a smile on his face and a pressed white rose clutched in his hand, the flower he'd left on the garden bench just days before. It should have been withered, dead, but somehow it remained fresh, its petals still soft, its scent still sweet. At his funeral, all of England mourned. But no one wept more than Prince William, who had lost not just a king, but the man who had learned to see miracles even through the fog of fear and regret. As the new king, William's first act was to establish hospitals throughout the realm, free to all who needed healing, funded by the crown. His second act was to commission a statue for Windsor Gardens, not of himself or his father, but of an unknown girl with bare feet and simple clothes, her hands raised as if performing a blessing. The inscription at the base read, "To the nameless healer who taught us to see." People came from across Europe to visit that statue, to touch those bronze hands, to pray for their own miracles. Some claimed that if you stood before it at dawn, you could feel a warmth radiating from the metal, as if the sun itself lived inside the stone. William never married. When courtiers pressed him about producing an heir, he would smile and say, "I already have children. Every patient I heal, every life I save, every soul I help see clearly in the darkness." He spent his days working in the Royal Infirmary and his evenings studying by candlelight, always searching for new ways to heal, new techniques to ease suffering. He trained physicians and surgeons, taught them not just the science of medicine, but the art of truly seeing patients, seeing their fear, their dignity, their worth beyond their affliction. And every morning, before the sun fully rose, he would stand before the empty reliquary in his study. He would place his hand over the invisible thread of faith inside, and he would whisper a prayer of thanks. Some days, he swore he felt an answering warmth under his palm, a reminder that the impossible is never as impossible as it seems. That somewhere, in some hidden corner of the world, miracles are still being worked by hands we'll never see. The years passed like pages in a book, each one filled with stories of healing and hope. King William became known throughout Europe as the Healing King, and people said that under his reign, England became a place where miracles happened not once, but every single day. On his 70th birthday, weak with age but still clear-eyed and purposeful, William made his final visit to the garden. He sat on the same stone bench where he had been healed so many decades before, and he looked up at the statue of the barefoot girl. "I kept my promise," he said aloud, not caring who might hear. "I used my sight to really see people. All people. The rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless, the beautiful and the broken, and in every face I found something worth healing." The statue seemed to smile down at him, though of course that was impossible. Bronze doesn't smile, bronze doesn't weep, bronze doesn't whisper in the wind. And yet, as William closed his eyes for the last time, he could have sworn he felt warm hands over his eyelids once more, gentle as morning light, certain as faith. "Thank you," a familiar voice whispered. "Thank you for seeing." They found him the next morning, peacefully past, sitting on the bench with a smile on his face and a single white rose in his lap. Around him, the garden had erupted in an impossible display, roses blooming out of season, their petals the purest white anyone had ever seen, their scent carrying a hint of something divine. The roses bloomed for 7 days, and on the 7th day, at dawn, a young girl with bare feet and a simple dress was seen walking through the eastern gate. She paused at the statue, touched the bronze hands with her own, and smiled as if greeting an old friend. Then she turned toward the bench where King William sat in eternal rest. She picked up the white rose from his lap, pressed it to her lips, and whispered something no one could hear. When the guards rushed forward, she was already gone. But in her place, scattered across the bench and the grass, were hundreds of white rose petals, each one gleaming like captured starlight. Some miracles, the people of England learned, seek no explanation. They simply are, like breath, like love, like the stubborn insistence of hope in the face of impossibility. In the years that followed, the statue in Windsor Gardens became a place of pilgrimage. Mothers brought blind children, fathers carried wounded soldiers, healers came to pray for guidance, and everyone who visited left with the same sense of warmth, of possibility, of being truly seen for the first time. The legend spread across centuries. Poets wrote verses about the nameless healer. Painters tried to capture her face. Though no two portraits looked alike, scholars debated whether she was angel or saint, mystic or miracle. But those who had known King William personally, his fellow physicians, his patients, the people whose lives he'd touched, they knew the truth. She had been real as suffering and joy, as real as fear and love, as real as the faith that moves mountains and restores sight to the blind. And somewhere, in some small village or hidden monastery, in some corner of the world where need calls out for healing, they believed she still walked, barefoot and certain, carrying nothing but the power to make the impossible possible, one miracle at a time. The inscription on King William's tomb, chosen by the physicians he'd trained, captured everything he had learned from that moment in the garden. If you made it this far, perhaps it's because you also believe that every person has worth, regardless of their position or circumstance. Perhaps you've felt the touch of grace in your own life, a moment when impossibility cracked open and showed you something divine. Tell us in the comments about a time when you witnessed or experienced something that science couldn't explain, but your heart knew was real. Today, if you visit Windsor Gardens at dawn, they say you can still feel a warmth in the air near the stone bench. Roses still bloom there out of season, their petals the purest white. And if you stand very still, with your eyes closed and your heart open, you might feel what King William felt that morning so long ago. Certain miracles King Edward discovered in his garden that spring morning seek no explanation. They require only hearts willing to believe. And believing, in the end, is the greatest miracle of all. That story carries a truth we all need to remember. The greatest healing doesn't come from what we can hold in our hands, but from what we're willing to hold in our hearts. Dignity isn't given by titles or wealth. It lives in every soul that refuses to be diminished by circumstance. And sometimes the people we dismiss as powerless are the very ones carrying the power to transform us completely. William's legacy lives on in every hospital, every healer who touches a patient with genuine care, every person who chooses to really see others rather than merely looking at them. His father's lesson, learned too late but learned nonetheless, echoes across generations. Fear can make us cruel, but love makes us wise. We hope this story touched your heart the way it's touched ours. If it did, please leave your like, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that miracles still exist, and subscribe so we can continue bringing you stories that inspire, heal, and help us all see a little more clearly. Your interaction helps us keep creating content that matters. Thank you for being part of this community, and remember, you never know when you might be the miracle someone else is waiting for. Little Prince William of Northumbria had been born blind, and despite England's finest physicians, his darkness remained absolute. In 1682, while the child waited alone in Windsor Gardens, a barefoot peasant girl with serene eyes approached. "I can help you, young lord," she whispered. William smiled, doubtful yet curious. "I am no physician," she continued. "I serve the great healer of heaven, who makes the impossible possible." With celestial tenderness, she touched his eyelids and, before stunned guards, withdrew a thin, transparent film, like divine thread of light. King Edward, enraged, shoved the girl aside. "Seize that witch!" But William cried out, weeping, "Father, I can see. I see the sky, the roses, your face." The garden fell silent. Royal physicians later confirmed the impossible. The tissue covering his retinas had vanished without trace or scar. Edward, remorseful, searched the entire kingdom for the girl, but she had vanished like morning mist. Days, months, years passed without sign. The king began to believe perhaps she was not of this world. William grew inspired by that miracle. He became royal physician, healing not only with science, but with love. In his infirmary, he kept the invisible thread inside a golden reliquary, inscribed by his father. Some heal with knowledge, others with faith, but only those who truly love restore sight to the heart. Edward, now elderly, returned each year to that garden, leaving white roses on the bench where it all began. Remembering that certain miracles seek no explanation, only hearts willing to believe.